Ivory silk draped the pews in lazy waves, and imported lilies too perfect. Two white satin towering arrangements as if they were meant to erase anything human that might seep into this moment. Every surface reflected light. Every detail promised permanence. And yet, as I stepped onto the runner, I felt the whole room trembling at the weight of what it was pretending not to be. My father stood near the front, his shoulders squared like a man who believed posture could hold up an empire. Harrison Calloway looked like the photographs people framed in boardrooms, sharp suit, steady jaw, eyes trained to never confess panic. But I knew him too well. I'd seen the late-night silences. I'd heard the locked office phone calls. I'd watched him flinch at numbers he refused to explain. Today he didn't look proud. He looked relieved. That was the first betrayal of the day. I held my bouquet like it was a prop I hadn't rehearsed with. The applause rose in gentle, practiced waves as I began the walk down the aisle. Faces turned toward me with the kind of admiration that never asks permission. They watched me the way people watch a signature, being placed on a contract, anticipating, eager, hungry for the final stroke. Smile, Vivienne. My mother whispered from the first pews I passed. Her eyes were glossy, not with joy but with the strain of holding herself together. This is what we do. We endure, and we protect. Endure. Protect. Those words had been stitched into every corner of my upbringing. They were always presented like virtues, never like chains. Dominic waited at the altar with his hands folded, calm as an investor reviewing a portfolio. His tuxedo was tailored so perfectly it almost made him look unreal. His expression was composed, polite, a man trained to appear gentle even when he was taking something. When my gaze found his, he offered a small smile, quiet reassurance. "You look incredible," he murmured when I reached him, low enough that no microphone could steal it. I wanted to believe it meant something. I wanted to feel chosen instead of transferred. But his eyes flicked just once toward my father. The motion was quick, almost unconscious, like he was checking whether the transaction was proceeding on schedule. The officiant began with warmth that sounded rehearsed. Words like unity, destiny, legacy. I listened as if from underwater, the phrases muffled by the roar of my own thoughts. In the first pew, Randall Mercer sat like a man attending his own coronation. His wife leaned toward a woman beside her and whispered something that made them both smile without looking at me. I caught fragments as I passed, soft enough to be deniable, sharp enough to land. Not exactly our kind, but Dominic insisted. Calloway money comes from ports and labor. You know how that looks. They'll polish her up. They always do. They didn't use slurs. They didn't need to. Their words were clean, sterile. That was the cruelty of it, racism delivered like etiquette, prejudice disguised as taste. My skin felt too visible. Dominic's family had always treated me like a beautiful exception they could tolerate, if I didn't remind them I existed beyond the role they needed me to play. They complimented my exotic elegance. At dinners, they asked where my mother's family was originally from, as if I couldn't be from right here. They praised me for being articulate, as if it surprised them. Today they watched me as if I were a prize that came with conditions. I took in a slow breath, forcing my shoulders to stay relaxed. The cameras were positioned like silent predators. Investors were streaming this. Business partners were watching. This wasn't a wedding. It was a performance meant to stabilize stock prices. And I was the centerpiece. The officiant spoke on, his hands open as if he were offering the room a blessing. We gather today to witness the union of two families, not two people. My father had told me last night in the quiet of his study, that this marriage would save us. Vivienne, he'd said, voice careful, eyes refusing, and then feelings. This is survival. I'd stared at him, waiting for him to say he was sorry. Waiting for him to say he'd found another way. But he'd only reached across his desk and covered my hand with his. The gesture heavy and desperate. You were born a Calloway, he'd whispered. And Calloways don't let their people drown. I should have asked then what he meant by our people. The company, the employees, the name, or him. Now at the altar, the officiant's words narrowed into the part I'd been dreading. If anyone present knows of any lawful reason. A sound cut for the cathedral before he could finish. Not a voice, not a gasp. A deep, metallic shift, the kind of sound that changes a room's temperature. The cathedral doors began to open. Every head turned. The air snapped tight. The music faltered, then died. Security moved instinctively, but not toward the doors, away from them. as if the entrance carried its own authority. A procession of black, uniformed guards stepped inside with measured precision. Their boots didn't echo like soldiers, they echoed like inevitability. And then he entered. Emperor Lucian Vale. I'd seen his face on international broadcasts, the kind that played silently in airport lounges, the kind that felt distant from ordinary life. He looked the same now and yet not. In person, he didn't feel like a man who held power. He felt like the concept of power walking on human legs. He stopped halfway down the aisle, scanning the cathedral with calm that made the room look frantic by comparison. His gaze moved past the pews, past the cameras, past Dominic and settled on me. Something strange happened in my chest then, like a memory trying to wake up. Not recognition of his face, but recognition of his attention. Like I'd been studied before without knowing it. Dominic stiffened beside me. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice too controlled to be confused. My father made a sound, small, involuntary. I turned slightly, watching Harrison Calloway's expression drain as if someone had reached into him and pulled out every remaining illusion. His lips parted, but no words came. Lucian walked the rest of the aisle without hurry. When he reached the front, he didn't address the officiant. He didn't acknowledge the mercers. He didn't even look at Dominic. He looked at me as if I were the only truth in the room. "Vivienne Calloway," he said, voice low but carrying easily through the cathedral. "This ceremony cannot continue." A murmur rippled through the guests' confusion, outraged disbelief. Randall Mercer rose halfway from his seat, his face tightening with offense. Lucian's gaze flicked once toward my father. "Because she is already bound." The words hit like a blade, clean and immediate. "Bound," Dominic repeated, the edge of his composure finally cracking. Lucian's expression did not change. "Under a sovereign engagement clause signed 20 years ago." My bouquet slipped slightly in my grip. My fingers tightened until the stems bit into my skin. I turned to my father slowly. Harrison's eyes were wide, glassy, trapped between guilt and fear. "What did he just say?" I whispered, and my voice sounded too small for a cathedral. My father didn't answer, he didn't deny it. He simply looked at me like a man watching the tide come in. Realizing too late he'd tied his daughter to the pier. As the emperor reached into his coat for a document sealed in black and gold, I understood the twist of the day. This wedding hadn't been arranged once, it had been arranged twice, and my father had hidden the first deal from me my entire life. Black wax stamped with gold, precise as a judgment, held between Lucian Vale's gloved fingers like the final piece of a ritual no one in this cathedral had consented to. The lilies suddenly smelled too sweet, almost rotten. The chandeliers above us still burned bright, but the light felt harsher now, like it was exposing things we'd all worked too hard to hide. Lucian angled the paper so the front row could see it first. Randall Mercer leaned forward, eyes narrowing as if he could intimidate ink into disappearing. Dominic's hand hovered near mine, not touching, not withdrawing, uncertain which performance he was supposed to maintain. "This is absurd," Randall said, loud enough to reclaim the room. "You don't get to walk into an American cathedral and rewrite American cathedral like you're conquering territory." Lucian's gaze shifted to him, with the patience of someone used to power, speaking louder than outrage. "I am not rewriting anything. I am acknowledging what already exists." My throat tightened. "What exists?" I forced the question out before I could lose the ability to speak at all. "You're saying my father signed something that binds me." "How?" Lucian's eyes returned to me, not soft, not cruel, just disturbingly steady. 20 years ago, your father requested emergency intervention from the Vale Dominion during a liquidity collapse. In exchange, he entered a sovereign covenant. A contingency clause. The firstborn Calloway daughter would be pledged in alliance if the Dominion invoked it. The words felt like they didn't belong in my body. Liquidity collapse. Covenant. Pledged. Like I was hearing about a different person's life. I turned to my father, waiting, begging for him to deny it. Harrison's face had gone pale in a way I'd never seen, as if the truth had drained the blood from him. "Dad," I said, and my voice shook despite how hard I tried to anchor it. "Tell me he's lying." My father swallowed. His eyes flicked toward the guests, then to the cameras, then back to me. "Vivienne," that was all it took. Not a denial. Not even a full sentence. Just the sound of my name spoken like an apology he'd rehearsed for years. The room began to fracture into noise, whispering gasps. The kind of murmurs that carry judgment and curiosity in equal measure. Someone in the back muttered, "So she's foreign property now?" And the words slid under my skin like a needle. I snapped my head toward the voice, but it was swallowed in the crowd. That was the cruelty of it. People could say anything, when they believed you weren't fully theirs. Randall Mercer stepped forward as if he could physically crowd Lucian into retreat. Not touching him, not fighting, just exerting presence, the way men like him always did. This is theater, Randall said, his voice sharpened with contempt. We all know what this is. A monarch swooping in because an American dynasty doesn't want to be wrested by someone who doesn't belong here. His emphasis landed where it was meant to. I felt eyes slide toward my mother, toward the parts of my heritage Charter Solston society pretended to celebrate, until it inconvenienced them. I had heard those insinuations my whole life. Calloway bloodline diluted, Calloway image softened, Calloway goal too polished to be real, too real to be comfortable. Lucian didn't flinch. Your objection is noted, he said. But your opinion does not alter the legal recognition of this covenant. Randall's smile was sharp. Legal recognition? In whose world? Yours? He turned, addressing the room like a jury. This is America, we don't bow. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a performance aimed at the audience watching. It was him planting a narrative: foreign ruler, American woman, stolen bride, humiliated groom. And under it all, the darker implication: people like him always assumed they had the right to define who belonged. Dominic finally spoke, voice tight. Vivienne, say something. Tell him you never agreed to this. I looked at Dominic, then really looked. His eyes weren't pleading for me. They were pleading for control. For the ceremony. For the plan. I didn't agree to any of this, I said, and my voice gained steel as I spoke. Not the Mercer arrangement. Not this covenant. I didn't agree to being traded like an asset. Dominic's jaw tightened, and for a second his mask slipped. This wasn't trading, he said. It was stability. Stability for who? I asked. Because it wasn't for me. The officiant tried to interject, hands raised, voice trembling. Perhaps we should. Lucian cut him off without raising his voice. The ceremony is suspended. It was the first time I truly understood what power looked like when it didn't need to shout. Behind Lucian, a pair of his advisors stepped forward with a folder thick enough to feel like a life sentence. They opened it carefully, turning pages with clinical precision. Seals. Signatures. Dates. Harrison's handwriting. My father's name, on paper, beside words that made my stomach turn. I reached for the documents, but my hands shook. Lucian didn't pull them away, he let me see. There it was: Harrison Calloway. Agreement, contingency, firstborn daughter. My vision blurred at the edges. You signed this when I was a child, I whispered. Harrison's voice broke. I was trying to save everything. Everything, I repeated, tasting the word. Not me. Then the unexpected twist struck from the side, quiet but lethal. One of Lucian's advisors spoke, tone professional, almost regretful. Ms. Calloway, there is an additional clause you should be aware of. I stared at him. Additional? He slid a page forward. If the covenant is invoked, refusal triggers enforcement measures. The Dominion can freeze specific Calloway maritime assets through international trade arbitration, assets that currently keep your company solvent. The room tilted, not because of the words alone, but because I understood what they meant. This wasn't just an old promise. It was a switch. A lever. A pressure point aimed directly at the empire my father claimed he was protecting. Randall Mercer laughed, low and cruel. So there it is, he said, eyes shining with satisfaction. Blackmail dressed as diplomacy. Lucian's gaze sharpened. It is not blackmail, it is consequence. And she's supposed to be grateful. Randall snapped. Then leaned slightly toward me, voice dropping into something cutting and intimate. Vivienne, don't let them fool you. They'll parade you around like proof they can take whatever they want. You think they see you as an equal. They see you as a symbol. A trophy. Something they can display to look civilized. The racism in it wasn't loud. It was surgical. It attacked my dignity by pretending to protect it. It reduced me to spectacle again. Lucian's eyes flicked to Randall. Enough. Randall lifted his hands, smiling. I'm just being honest. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe through the humiliation. Through the sense of being watched, judged, owned by competing narratives. Then Lucian turned back to me, and for the first time, something in his expression softened, not into pity, but into something like restraint. I did not come here to claim you, he said quietly, so only I could truly feel the weight of it. I came because this marriage, this Mercer merger, was not the only trap being set for you. My pulse stumbled. What trap? Lucian's gaze held mine like a warning. If you say I do today, you will sign more than vows. You will sign the end of Calloway autonomy. Dominic's head snapped toward him. That's a lie. Lucian didn't look at Dominic. Your father knows it isn't. All eyes shifted to Randall Mercer, whose smile thinned just enough to reveal anger beneath it. Outside, I heard the distant rise of sirens, and the swelling murmur of accruthering reporters arriving, hungry for scandal. The cathedral had become a pressure chamber, and I was the fragile thing at its center. Lucian lowered his voice again. You have a choice, Vivienne. Honor the covenant and accept protection. Or reject it and face what the Mercers intend alone. My mouth went dry. How much time do I have? Lucian's eyes didn't blink. Hours. As the cathedral doors rattled with the growing storm of press outside, Lucian leaned closer and delivered the final, chilling detail. Dominic's prenup wasn't waiting at the altar, it had already been filed, and my signature had been forged on the first page. The cathedral doors closed behind us with a heavy finality, muting the roar of reporters outside into a distant predatory hum. Lucian's security escorted my father, Lucian, and me into a private chamber behind the altar, an old vestry room lined with dark wood, and portraits of long, dead bishops who had probably never imagined witnessing a corporate war disguised as a wedding. My bouquet was still in my hands. I hadn't realized I was gripping it until petals began falling onto the polished floor. Start talking, I said to my father. Harrison Calloway looked smaller in that room. Not physically, he was still the same commanding figure who had built a shipping empire, but diminished in certainty. The man who had always filled boardrooms with quiet authority, now struggled to meet his daughter's eyes. 20 years ago, he began, voice hoarse. Calloway Shipping was attacked from every direction at once. Regulatory audits, enormous fraud allegations. Creditors pulling lines overnight. It wasn't natural, it was coordinated. Who? I asked. We never proved it, he said to Gain. Lucian remained silent, watching, allowing the confession to unfold without interruption. We were days from collapse, my father continued. If we'd filed bankruptcy, thousands of employees would have lost their jobs. Families. Generations tied to our ports. And there were criminal inquiries forming false ones, but enough to destroy us publicly. So you sold me, I said. His head snapped up. I saved us. The distinction hung between us like a crack in glass. The veiled Dominion stepped in quietly, he said. Capital effusion routed through shell partnerships. Enough liquidity to stop the bleeding. In exchange there was a clause. A sovereign engagement contingency. It was supposed to be symbolic. Political. Insurance. I repeated. On me, he flinched. Lucian finally spoke, his tone even. My predecessor believed alliances built through blood were more durable than alliances built through contracts. And you? I asked him. His gaze held mine. I believe consent makes them legitimate. The difference mattered. It didn't erase the past, but it shifted the present. My father exhaled shakily. I never thought they'd invoke it. The Dominion had no reason to. Until the Mercers. The name felt acidic. Randall Mercer didn't just propose a merger. Harrison continued. He's been layering leverage for years. Strategic loans. Minority acquisitions. Quiet refinancing of our debt through intermediaries. Dominic's voice echoed in my memory. Stability partnership. Inevitable. You're saying this wedding, my voice trailed, would have finalized majority control, my father admitted. The prenuptial agreement included restructuring clauses. Once signed, Calloway Shipping would technically remain ours in name, but operational authority would shift. Gradually. Legally, Lucian added, absorption disguised as unity. The room went silent. It wasn't rescue, it was surrender elegantly packaged. I felt something inside me cool. The humiliation from the cathedral began to crystallize into clarity. Or this time, I said slowly, I thought I was choosing between loyalty and selfishness. Between protecting our name and protecting myself. Harrison's voice cracked. Vivienne, I was trying to shield it from this. You shielded me from the truth. I replied, not the danger. Outside the chamber, I could hear the muffled chaos of media speculation building into narrative. I imagined headlines forming already. American heiress halted by foreign ruler. Bride caught in international dispute. Woman at center of power struggle. They would flatten it into spectacle. They always did. Lucian stepped slightly closer, though still keeping distance respectful enough to breathe. There is something else you deserve to know, he said. I braced myself. Years ago at a diplomatic youth summit in Switzerland, he continued, there was a staged security breach during a policy simulation. You were part of the American delegation. The memory flicker faintly cold air, multilingual chatter, a sudden alarm that felt too real. I remember chaos, I said cautiously. People panicked. You didn't, he replied. His voice carried no flattery, only fact. You redirected attendees towards secondary exits. You noticed a delegate having an anxiety episode and stayed behind to ensure he wasn't trampled in the rush. A realization hit me slowly. That was you. He inclined his head slightly. Yes. The memory sharpened. A young man in a tailored suit, trying to maintain composure while the room spiraled. I had assumed he was just another delegate overwhelmed by the drill. I didn't know who you were. I said. That is why it mattered, Lucien answered. Silence filled the chamber again. But it felt different now, less suffocating, more weighted with intention. When your name resurfaced in the dormant covenant, he continued, I remembered your instinct. You protect others first. I chose to intervene because I believed you deserved to see the board before you were moved across it. This wasn't abstract enforcement. It wasn't conquest. It was deliberate. My father looked between us, something like regret settling deeper into his posture. You were never meant to carry this burden, he said to me. But I am, I replied quietly. A knock at the chamber door interrupted us. One of Lucien's advisors entered discreetly. Sire, he said, addressing Lucien, Mercer legal teams have begun briefing press. They're framing this as foreign coercion. Our markets are reacting. Of course they were. Dominic hadn't followed us into the chamber. That absence now felt louder than his presence ever had. I straightened slowly, smoothing the creases from my dress. The silk felt heavier now, not bridal, but ceremonial, like armor I hadn't asked to wear. If I go through with the wedding, I said carefully, the optics stabilize. The Mercers gain control. Calloway autonomy disappears quietly. Yes, my father admitted. If I honor the sovereign clause, I continued. The Dominion shields us, but I become a political symbol. Headlines shift, but control remains contested. Yes, Lucien said. And if I reject both? Neither man answered immediately. Then you ignite open war, Lucien said finally. Economic, reputational, personal. Fear pressed against my ribs, but beneath it, something steadier was forming. Obedience would preserve appearances. Defiance would reclaim myself. I walked to the mirror mounted above the vestry sink. The reflection staring back at me was immaculate makeup, flawless veil perfectly arranged. She looked like a bride. She was not. I removed the veil first. The pins slid free easily, almost disappointingly simple. The lace fell into my hands like something borrowed. My father inhaled sharply. Vivienne. I won't be transferred, I said without turning. Not to the Mercers, not to the Dominion, not without my consent. Lucien watched silently. I stepped back into the corridor leading toward the main hall, bouquet discarded on the vestry table. The noise of reporters outside grew louder with every step. When the cathedral doors opened again, it wasn't for a ceremony. It was for an announcement. Standing before the cameras, before Dominic's rigid disbelief, before Randall Mercer's calculating glare, I spoke clearly. This wedding will not proceed. Jas erupted like sparks. I will not enter UNT on concealed leverage, I continued. Not for optics. Not for stability. Dominic's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, he said under his breath, close enough that only I could hear. Maybe, I replied quietly. But it will be my mistake. The flash of cameras became blinding. Behind me Lucien stood, not triumphant, not possessive, simply present. As Mercer executives began issuing rapid statements to the press and market alerts surged across financial networks, I felt the ground shifting beneath Charleston's society. I turned slightly toward Lucien. You invited me to the Veiled Dominion? I said softly. Yes. I drew with a breath that tasted like risk. Then I accept. As the first wave of Calloway stock began to plunge in real time and Randall Mercer made a call that would trigger immediate financial retaliation, I realized stepping onto Lucien's aircraft would mean walking directly into a battle larger than a broken wedding. It wasn't colder, not physically. It was quieter in a way Charleston had never been. No polite laughter used as weapons. No whispered judgments disguised as tradition. No familiar faces pretending they weren't watching my every breath. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and something sterile, like decisions made in sealed rooms. A veiled security officer offered me water with a neutral expression that didn't ask me to perform gratitude. My phone vibrated endlessly in my palm. Board members, friends, reporters. Numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't answer any of them. I just stared at the screen until the battery icon felt like a countdown. Lucien sat across from me with a folder open on his lap, reading without urgency. The calm on him wasn't comforting, it was unsettling, like he had already lived through worse storms and found them manageable. "You understand what accepting my invitation means?" he said without looking up. "It means I'm walking into your world," I replied. "Where nothing is accidental." His gaze lifted to mine. "Nothing that matters." That was the first time it hit me that this wasn't just geography. This was a different kind of gravity. When we landed, I expected spectacle flags, ceremonial greetings, cameras. Instead, the veiled meaning received me like a classified file. The runway was clean, the vehicles unmarked, the movements precise. Even the city skyline, visible in the distance, looked disciplined. Glass towers rose beside ancient stone fortifications like the Dominion itself was saying, "We modernize but we don't forget power." As the motorcade moved through the capital, I watched pedestrians pause at intersections, not to gawk, but to observe briefly and then continue. The streets were calm without being dead. Order without oppression. The buildings didn't beg for admiration, they assumed it. Charleston would have made my arrival into theater. Here, it felt like procedure. At the palace complex, part fortress, part modern administrative hub, I was guided through corridors that seemed designed to erase uncertainty. Walls of pale stone. Minimal ornament, lighting that didn't flatter anyone. Even silence felt intentional. Lucien didn't take me to a guest suite first. He took me to a briefing room. A large display covered one wall, already glowing with charts, maps, and live market feeds. Calloway shipping's ticker sat in the corner like a pulse monitor. Down again. The red felt personal. A woman in a dark suit introduced herself as Director Celine Hart, Head of Trade Intelligence. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She looked at me the way surgeons look at a patient, without judgment, but with urgency. "Ms. Calloway," she said, "Mercer affiliates have begun coordinated supplier pressure. Several vendors are already renegotiating terms. 2 port unions are being approached with incentives to strike. The goal is to create instability in your logistics network." I swallowed. "They're trying to make us look incompetent." "They're trying to make you look ungovernable," she corrected. "Incompetence can be fixed. Chaos is easier to exploit." On the screen, American outlet fair Yuya RSFESTO for IGN. The words stung in a specific way. Fis, for IGN, Terang. As if my autonomy was a betrayal. As if my presence anywhere outside an American cathedral was proof I didn't belong. Another headline followed, more subtle, more poisonous, QCESTEOS ABL and SAVIN scale. Background. The word that always meant blood, skin origin. I felt heat climb my neck. "They're turning it into," I couldn't even finish. Lucien's voice was steady. "A narrative war." Yes, Director Hart tapped a control, expanding a map of trade corridors. "If the Dominion activates sovereign protection at full scale, we can counter Mercer pressure through arbitration, credit guarantees, and shipping corridor prioritization." "And the cost?" I asked. Hart glanced to Lucien before answering. "Oversight. Regulatory alignment. Certain Calloway decisions would require Dominion review." So there it was, safety with strings. Not romantic chains, administrative ones. Paperwork that could become a cage if I didn't understand it. Lucien turned the folder toward me. "Read what protection actually means. Not what people say it means." I took the folder and felt my hands steady as I flipped through the pages. Clause triggers. Oversight frameworks. Arbitration pathways. It was terrifying how easily a life could be outlined in paragraphs. "This looks like control," I said quietly. "It can be," Lucien replied. "Or it can be partnership. The difference is whether you enter it awake." I exhaled slowly, forcing my mind to stay sharp. "I'm not signing anything blind." Hart studied me with a flicker of something like approval. "Good." They moved into specifics: how Mercer, back short sellers were coordinating, how media partners were amplifying foreign influence, how a whisper campaign was being fed into elite American circles that already liked their prejudice tidy and respectable. One analyst said, almost casually, "They're using the word un-American in a way that's meant to feel cultural. Another soft word that carried sharp edges. I looked at Lucien. "Do you know what they called me in that cathedral?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "No. Not openly." I hated how my voice wanted to crack. "They talked around it. Like my skin is a rumor they can't confirm but are excited to discuss." Silence held the room for a beat. Not pity. Recognition. Lucien's tone lowered. "They are trying to reduce you to an argument." Because if you remain a person, they lose. That sentence landed deeper than I expected. The next briefing was with members of Lucian's council, men and women whose faces carried controlled skepticism. They watched me like I was an unstable asset. I could almost hear the unspoken thought, American heiress, scandal attached, fragile. One older councilman leaned back and said, "If we bind our economy to hers, we inherit her enemies." I met his gaze. "You already have them. I'm just the story they're using." A murmur passed through the room. Not agreement. Not resistance. Evaluation. Lucian didn't interrupt. He let me stand in it. I requested access to Calloway operational maps, real ones, not sanitized ones, shipping lanes, port dependencies, contract clusters, vulnerable choke points. As the data filled the screen, patterns emerged. Too many critical flows relied on too few ports, too few suppliers, too few political favors. I felt sick realizing how fragile our empire had become under the illusion of scale. I pointed to the network. "Mercer doesn't have to destroy us entirely," I said. "He just has to make us unreliable." Hart nodded once. "Exactly." I paced slowly, the sound of my heels sharp against stone. "Then we stop being a single target." The council watched. I spoke before fear could thin my words. "We decentralize. We convert vulnerable ports into joint sovereign commercial hubs. Not ownership transfer, shared operational frameworks with clear autonomy boundaries. We diversify suppliers by region. We reroute critical lanes through multi-node corridors so no single strike cripples us." One councilwoman raised an eyebrow. "You're proposing a hybrid model?" "I'm proposing survival without surrender," I replied. Lucian's gaze stayed on me, unreadable, but the room's temperature shifted. They weren't looking at a bride anymore. They were looking at a strategist. Then Director Hart's phone buzzed. She glanced down, and for the first time her expression changed barely, but enough. "They've begun," she said. On the screen, Calloway's ticker dipped again, fast, unnatural. A cascade, not a drift, coordinated short selling. Hart confirmed. "This is the opening strike." My chest tightened. I could almost picture Randall Mercer smiling as he watched the numbers fall, satisfied that his narrative was working. "She ran, so the empire collapses." Another headline flashed. "Calloway still FAOIA foreign fair." Foreign again, always foreign. Even when I was born on American soil, even when the docks my family built fed American cities, even when the labor that my name valuable was American hands. Lucian stepped closer to the display, calm as a blade. "This is the moment they want you to panic." I turned to him. "My don't activate sovereign defense." Hart answered before he could. "Then you face this alone. And the Mercers will make sure you look like you deserve it." Lucian's voice was quiet. "If you activate it fully, you gain protection. But you accept scrutiny. You accept that every choice will be interpreted as allegiance to the Dominion." The room felt smaller around me. Like Charleston had followed me here, hidden in headlines and language, chasing me across borders. I looked at the folder in my hands again. I saw the words that could save my company and trap it. I saw the clauses that could restore stability and let critics claim I sold my country for a crown. My phone vibrated again, this time with a message preview from a board member. "Babu ini edu fahs, nabu not please, not how are you, not are you safe, just fix." I lifted my head. "If I activate sovereign defense," I said, "Mercer will escalate." Hart's eyes didn't blink. "Yes." Lucian's gaze held mine. "And if you don't, he won't need to." As the market clock ticked toward the next opening and Director Hart slid a pen across the table toward me, Lucian leaned in and murmured the final twist. Mercer hadn't just attacked Calloway shipping. He had quietly acquired a controlling interest in my father's personal debt. Meaning Harrison's freedom was now collateral in whatever decision I made next. We stood in the Dominion's strategy room, eyes fixed on the massive screen as the opening bell echoed faintly through financial networks thousands of miles away. Calloway shipping dropped another 12% in the first 3 minutes. The red numbers bled downward so fast it felt violent, even though no one raised their voice. "That's not retail panic," Director Hart said quietly. "That's coordinated." I didn't need confirmation. I could feel Randall Mercer's fingerprints on it, the precision, the timing. He wasn't trying to destroy us instantly. He was trying to humiliate us publicly. To make me look reckless, emotional, ungrateful. Another headline flashed across the feed. "Calloway quotidian for a NIFLNCE foreign." Again my phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from American commentators dissecting my sudden allegiance. One analyst went on record suggesting that women like me were easily dazzled by titles. Another insinuated that my background made me more susceptible to external loyalties. It wasn't just economic warfare, it was cultural exile. Lucian stood beside me, hands clasped behind his back. You cannot outshout propaganda, he said, you outlast it. I turned to him. And in the meantime, he replied evenly, you lead. The Calloway Executive Board demanded an emergency call. I requested a secure line and refused any intermediaries. When their faces filled the screen, some angry, some frightened, some already calculating their exits, I didn't soften my posture. We're under coordinated attack, I began. Not because of instability. Because of consolidation pressure from Mercer affiliates. One director cut in sharply. This is happening because you ran to a foreign sovereign. It's happening because we were already vulnerable. I replied without flinching. And because we've hidden that vulnerability behind optics for years. Silence followed. That was new. I had never spoken to them without deference before. I continued. There were clauses in the Mercer prenup that would have shifted operational quietly over time. If I had signed, you would be reporting to Randall Mercer within 18 months. A few faces stiffened. One muttered something off-make. I won't defend decisions made in secrecy. I said. Not my father's. Not yours, not mine. From this point forward, transparency is not optional. The line went quiet in a different way, less combative, more uncertain. Then I delivered the decision. We are activating Sovereign Alliance underrated autonomy terms. Not absorption, partnership. With explicit boundaries. A board member scoffed. You're handing the company to the Dominion. No, I said calmly. I'm preventing it from being handed to Mercer. Lucian's legal team moved swiftly once I signed the amended activation framework. Capital reserves were injected with precision, not spectacle. Credit guarantees went public within the hour. Arbitration warnings were issued to suppliers threatening unlawful withdrawal. By mid-afternoon, the bleeding slowed. By evening, the stock stabilized, not soaring, not triumphant, steady. The media reaction, however, mutated. Mercer-backed commentators pivoted from financial criticism to personal narrative. I was labeled manipulated, seduced by power, controlled by a monarch with ulterior motives. Anonymous sources suggested I lacked cultural loyalty. A columnist wrote that women like me were historically vulnerable to imperial fantasies. It was astonishing how quickly the language turned intimate, as if my identity were public property to dissect. In the Dominion Council chamber that night, some members watched the coverage with narrowed eyes. They're testing whether we'll defend you publicly. One councilwoman said. Lucian didn't look at the screen. He looked at me. Will you defend yourself? The question unsettled me. I had spent my life being defended by men in tailored suits, my father, lawyers, publicists. And yet here I was, accused of betrayal by people who never considered me fully theirs. Yes, I said finally. But not by reacting, unexpectedly. Something shifted in the American media cycle the following morning. A viral clip resurfaced footage from the cathedral, showing me removing my veil before cameras, stating clearly that I refused to be transferred like an asset. The clip spread faster than Mercer's commentary. One anchor reframed it differently. Another asked on air, why is a woman defending her company's autonomy being labeled disloyal? Public sentiment began to fracture. For every voice accusing me of foreign allegiance, another asked why Mercer's consolidation tactics weren't being scrutinized. For every insinuation about my background, someone countered with the fact that Calloway Shipping had employed American workers for generations. Sympathy wasn't unanimous. But it was present inside the Dominion Council. Skepticism softened almost imperceptibly. I was no longer just a liability imported with scandal. I was a leader absorbing impact. Director Hart entered the room late that afternoon with a different expression, less analytical, more urgent. They're preparing the next phase, she said. I felt my stomach tighten. Financial, regulatory. She projected a draft briefing allegedly circulating among U.S. regulators. It referenced the original sovereign covenant distorted, selectively framed. It suggested undisclosed foreign influence over American maritime infrastructure. It hinted at national security concerns. They're going to leak this? Hart said. Out of context. In fragments. Enough to trigger investigation. I stared at the screen. If regulators opened a probe under suspicion of foreign manipulation, it wouldn't matter that the covenant had been dormant for decades. It would become proof of secret allegiance. They want me defensive, I said slowly. Cornered. Lucian nodded once. They want you explaining instead of leading. The room felt colder. If they control the narrative, Hart continued, you'll spend months responding to accusations rather than executing reform. I thought of Charleston, of the cathedral, of whispers about loyalty and belonging, of how easily people shaped a woman into a cautionary tale. No, I said quietly. Lucian's gaze sharpened. No, we don't wait for the leak. Hart blinked. You're suggesting preemptive disclosure. I'm suggesting we detonate it ourselves, I replied. Fully, transparently. Not fragments, not distortions. The council murmured uneasy. That's risky, one member warned. You could trigger the very investigation you're trying to avoid. Or we control the context, I said. Why explain the collapse 20 years ago? The capital infusion, the contingency clause. The fact that it was never invoked until now. We show the Mercer prenup clauses. All of it. Lucian studied me for a long moment. That will expose your father's decisions. It already has, I answered. The difference is whether it's done honestly. Silence settled heavy and deliberate. Outside the palace windows, the city lights flickered against ancient stone, modern towers standing beside old walls. Continuity through evolution. The Dominion didn't hide its history. It integrated it. Maybe that was the lesson. I looked at Lucien. I want the Grand Assembly Hall. His brow lifted slightly. For what purpose? For a press conference, I said. International lave, no pre-recorded statements. Director Hart inhaled sharply. That could either stabilize everything or ignite it. I felt fear coil low in my stomach, but beneath it something steadier. I'm done being interpreted, I said. If there's going to be a scandal, it will be mine to explain. Lucian held my gaze, measuring resolve rather than emotion. When? He asked. Tomorrow, I said. As communications teams scrambled to prepare the largest international press conference of my life, Director Hart received one final intelligence alert. Mercer wasn't just planning a leak, he had secured a high-ranking American official ready to publicly accuse me of compromising national security. Hours before I would step to the podium, stone columns rose like disciplined sentinels, and the ceiling's geometric vaults made every sound carry farther than it should. The room wasn't ornate in the way Charleston had been. It didn't try to charm, it tried to endure. Camera rigs lined the perimeter, their red recording lights blinking like patient predators. Beyond them sat rows of international press, some curious, some skeptical, some already committed to the story they wanted. I stood behind the lectern with my hands flat on its surface to keep them from shaking. Lucian was a step to my right, not looming, not possessive. Just present. His posture read as calm to the cameras, but I could feel the alertness in him, the controlled readiness of someone who understood that words, not weapons, were the sharpest instruments here. A countdown clock glowed on monitor off to the side. 10 seconds. Director Hart leaned in one last time, voice low. They're running the accusation in 3-2. A large screen on the far wall, where live feeds were being monitored, flickered. A U.S. official appeared at a podium back home, flanked by flags and stern faces. The Chiron beneath his image renate IMCES OS KO wow OIMO. My stomach dropped. This was Mercer's move, time to poison the room before I spoke. The official's tone was measured, carefully righteous. He didn't mention me by name at first. He didn't have to. He described foreign influence over American maritime infrastructure. He referenced undisclosed agreements. He used the word loyalty, the way people use it when they want to decide who belongs and who doesn't. Then he said, we must investigate whether Miss Vivienne Calloway has compromised American interests. Vivienne Calloway. Not CEO, not executive, not citizen. Miss. Felt the old familiar burn behind my ribs, the same burn I'd felt in the cathedral when someone suggested I wasn't their kind. When they talked about my background, like it was a stain that could spread. They never said it outright. They didn't need to. The implication was always the same: an American woman who doesn't fit their image is always a little suspicious. Lucian's gaze slid toward the feed, then back to me. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His silence was permission. Lead. The countdown hit 0. The hall's lights shifted slightly brighter. The microphones activated. I leaned forward and began before anyone could ask a question. Before the narrative could harden further. My name is Vivienne Calloway, I said, voice steadier than I felt. And today I'm disclosing information that should have been disclosed long ago. A ripple moved through the press. Pens lifted. Cameras zoomed. 20 years ago, Calloway Shipping suffered a coordinated financial attack. Credit lines were pulled without warning. Regulatory investigations were triggered under false allegations. The company was days from bankruptcy. Thousands of employees, dock workers, logistics teams, union families were at risk of losing everything. I saw flashes from cameras reflecting off the stone. My father, Harrison Calloway, sought emergency intervention, not from an American institution. From the Vale Dominion, the room stiffened. I could almost hear the mental headlines forming. Foreign rescue, secret deal, scandal confirmed. I didn't let them breathe long enough to twist it. The intervention was discreet, it stabilized payroll and operations. It prevented collapse. But it came with a contingency clause, what you will hear described as a sovereign engagement covenant. A wave of murmurs traveled. I kept going. That covenant was wrong. Not because international agreements are inherently wrong, but because it tied a future person me to a decision I never consented to. My throat tightened on the last word. But I didn't let it crack. I was a child. I did not sign it. I did not agree to it. And I will not be treated as an asset in any agreement, domestic or foreign. I felt the energy shift. Some faces softened, others sharpened. Then I delivered what Mercer didn't want them to hear. This covenant was dormant for 2 decades. It was not invoked until the day my arranged marriage was scheduled, because that marriage was not a union of love. It was a corporate acquisition. The Mercer family arranged a prenuptial framework designed to transfer operational control of Calloway shipping, full restructuring clauses hidden in legal language. A reporter shouted, "Do you have proof?" "Yes," I answered and nodded to Director Hart. A screen behind me lit up with redacted excerpts, clauses, timelines, signatures, legal commentary. Enough to show the pattern without exposing confidential identifiers. Randall Mercer's strategy now sat under bright light, it couldn't pretend to be romance. I heard a few journalists whisper the word, hostile. Good. I continued, that wedding. I did not do it to seek a crown. I did it to refuse coercion. Then, without planning to, my voice sharpened. And I will say this clearly, because certain narratives rely on coded language. Questioning my loyalty because of where I stand or what I look like is not patriotism. It is prejudice dressed in concern. A hush settled. Even the cameras seemed to hold still. Lucian shifted slightly, subtle support, not interruption. I turned my head toward him just enough to address the implication that he was the captor in this story. Emperor Lucian Vale did not come to claim a bride, I said. He came to stop a corporate takeover and to force a truth into the open that my own family had buried. Lucian faced the press. Calloway's autonomy is not negotiable, he said evenly. No marriage will occur without full voluntary consent and legal equality. The phrase legal equality landed like a stamp. Not romance, not possession, terms. A reporter asked, "Are you engaged to the emperor?" I let the question hang for a beat, then answered with the bluntness it deserved. I am not anyone's property, there is no engagement. There is a treaty framework being renegotiated into a modern bilateral charter, one that replaces personal obligation with institutional partnership. The unexpected twist came when Director Hart stepped forward and, with my nod, released one more document, a communication trail showing that the American official who'd accused me of compromising national security had received undisclosed campaign support, tied to Mercer-linked entities. The hall erupted. Not shouting, something sharper. The sound of a narrative snapping. Questions turned. Cameras recalibrated. The press pivoted in real time, hungry now for the corruption angle Mercer hadn't anticipated. Within hours, regulators publicly praised the disclosure process, emphasizing that voluntary transparency mattered. Markets responded with cautious relief. Calloway stock stabilized further. Mercer stock dipped as scrutiny expanded beyond me and onto them, and yet, when the lights dimmed and the microphones went silent, the victory felt strangely incomplete. Because the public war had shifted in my favor. But the private question remained. What was I to Lucian Vale beyond a crisis partner? Beyond a symbol in someone else's chess game? As I stepped away from the lectern, my legs finally remembered how to tremble. Lucian didn't reach for me. He didn't touch my elbow like a man claiming ownership. He simply walked beside me at the same pace, matching stride with stride. In a corridor beyond the hall, away from cameras and staff, he spoke quietly, "Vivienne." I looked up, still hearing echoes of the word foreign. Still feeling the heat of being judged as if I weren't fully American enough to be trusted. "Yes, I want to speak with you privately," he said. "No advisors. No documents. No counsel." My pulse tightened. "About the charter," His expression held something unreadable. "Wait without force, about you," he said. As Lucian led me toward a sealed door guarded by no one at all, I realized the next conversation could decide not just an alliance, but the one choice I'd never been brave enough to make without a contract telling me who I was supposed to be. The corridor beyond the assembly hall grew quieter with every step. Lucian led me through a narrow passage I hadn't noticed before, stone walls unadorned, the air cooler, the noise of press and politics fading behind us. No guards. No advisors. Just the echo of our footsteps, steady and synchronized at the end of the passage. A single door opened into a chamber overlooking the sea. The water stretched wide and dark beneath a silver sky. Ships moved across the horizon like deliberate thoughts, slow, purposeful, unhurried. These were the same trade routes that had entangled our families in obligation and strategy. The same waters that carried Calloway cargo for generations. Lucian closed the door behind us softly. For the first time since Charleston, there were no witnesses. He removed his jacket, draping it over the back of a chair. The gesture was simple, almost disarming. Without the ceremonial lines of authority framing him, he looked less like an institution and more like a man who had carried weight for too long. "I did not ask you here to discuss the charter," he said. The honesty in his tone unsettled me more than any political maneuver could have. "Then why?" I asked. He stepped closer to the window, not looking at me immediately. "Because somewhere between that cathedral and this hall, our alliance stopped being purely strategic." I didn't speak. I let him continue. "It began as obligation," he said. "A dormant covenant. A debt inherited. I intervened because I believed you deserved awareness. Because I remembered who you were in Switzerland. But what followed was not obligation. It was partnership under pressure." He turned then, meeting my gaze directly. "And I will not allow that partnership to blur into something without clarity." The words struck deeper than I expected. "You think I'm confused?" I said quietly. "I think you've been cornered your entire life," he replied, "first by your father's fear. Then by Mercer's ambition. Then by public narratives about loyalty and identity. I will not become another corner." The air shifted in my chest. For so long every man in a position of power around me had spoken in decisions. My father had spoken in sacrifice. Dominic had spoken in inevitability. Randall had spoken in entitlement. Lucian was speaking in restraint. "My resistance," I said slowly, "was never about marriage." He waited. "It was about ownership," I continued. "About being reduced to a clause. A surname. A strategic asset." He nodded once. "And if I were to ask you for anything beyond alliance, it would not be as emperor." Silence settled, but it wasn't heavy. It was open. "I don't need rescuing," I said, testing the words. "I know," he replied immediately. "I don't need protecting for myself." "I know that too." I searched his face for performance. I found none. "What do you need?" he asked instead. The question felt almost foreign. No one had asked me that without attaching conditions. "I need to choose," I said finally. "Not react. Not comply. Not defy for the sake of defiance. Choose." Lucian stepped closer, closing some of the distance but not all. "Then choose with no pressure from me." An unexpected twist rose in my chest, not doubt about him, but about myself. Because somewhere in the chaos of exposure and economic warfare, something had shifted quietly between us. Respect had grown roots. Trust had taken shape in late-night briefings and shared silences. The partnership we forged in crisis felt steadier than anything I'd ever known in comfort. That steadiness frightened me more than Mercer's attacks ever had. "Do you understand what it would mean?" I asked. "For me to align with you personally?" "It would mean scrutiny," he answered. "From your country. From mine. It would mean accusations that you surrendered. That I acquired. It would mean that every success you achieve will be attributed to me by those who need you diminished." The honesty of it burned. "And if I walk away?" I pressed. "Then the charter stands," he said calmly. "The Dominion and Calloway Shipping remain partners. You remain autolapses. No threat? No leverage." I turned toward the sea again, watching a cargo vessel glide across the horizon. Those waters had carried my family's wealth. They had also carried my father's fear. They had been used to justify decisions made in my name. For the first time, they felt like something else. "Possibility. I've spent my life proving I can endure," I said softly. "Proving I can survive humiliation, pressure, coded prejudice. Maybe strength isn't about enduring anymore." Lucian's voice lowered. "What is it about?" "Choosing something not because I'm cornered into it," I answered. "But because I want it." The admission felt like stepping off a ledge without knowing the depth below. He studied me carefully. Not evaluating, not calculating. Just present. I will not propose today, he said quietly. Not while the charter is still being finalized. I refuse to let personal decisions be confused with political timing. That, more than anything, told me who he was. I wouldn't accept if you did, I replied, a faint smile breaking through the tension. A rare softness crossed his expression. Good. We stood in silence again, watching the trade routes that had bound us long we understood them. My resistance, I said after a moment, was never about you. I know, he said. It was about not being owned. And if you were never owned, he asked gently. The question lingered. I realized then that choosing freely would require more courage than rejecting publicly. Rejecting was easy when the trap was visible. Choosing required vulnerability when there was no cage at all. A knock sounded faintly at the chamber door. Director Hart's voice came through, respectful but firm. Your Majesty, the bilateral charter is ready for ratification. Reality returned with quiet authority. Lucian looked at me. After this is signed, our nations are aligned by structure. What comes next is entirely separate. I inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of generation pressing against my spine, and the strange lightness of finally standing upright beneath it. We walked back toward the door together, not touching, not distant, equal. As we stepped into the corridor, I knew the next choice would not be about treaties or markets. It would be about identity. With the bilateral charter finalized, and the world waiting to see whether alliance would turn into union, I realized that the next words spoken between Lucian and me would define not just our legacy, but who I chose to become when no one was forcing my hand. It arrives like quiet machinery finally running the way it was always supposed to, trade routes stabilizing, employees returning to predictable shifts, vendors signing contracts without fear of retaliation, headlines losing interest because the chaos no longer feeds them. The Calloway, Veil Charter replaced the old sovereign clause with something modern, visible, and accountable. No sealed contingencies. No human beings treated like collateral. Just structure written openly enough that anyone could challenge it if it ever tried to become a cage. The first time I saw the final charter printed and bound, I ran my fingers along the spine and felt a strange emotion I couldn't name. Not triumph. Not relief. Something closer to grief for the years I spent trying to earn safety through obedience. The world called it diplomacy. The world called it an economic miracle. The world called it a scandal that turned into a case study. But inside me it felt like a personal boundary that had finally learned how to stand without shaking. Calloway Shipping's ticker stopped bleeding. The Mercer pressure campaign weakened as regulators and investigative journalists followed the money trails we'd exposed. The same outlets that had once used coded language, background American, were forced to cover something uglier. How easily a powerful family tried to absorb an empire through paperwork and narrative. Still, prejudice doesn't disappear just because the market stabilizes. Even months later, certain American panels kept replaying my face beside Lucian's, insisting I looked too comfortable in the Veil Dominion, as if comfort itself was proof of betrayal. One commentator laughed on air and said, "Well, she always seemed like the type who wanted a throne." And the studio chuckled the way people do when they want to make cruelty sound like wit. I watched that clip alone one night, and felt my hands curl into fists, not because it hurt, but because it reminded me what I'd escaped. The old version of me would have tried to prove them wrong with politeness. The new version of me understood that some people need you reduced so they can remain certain of their own place. Lucian didn't try to talk me out of the anger. He didn't tell me to ignore it. He sat beside me with a stillness that felt like shared dignity. They will always look for a way to explain your agency as something given to you, he said quietly. If it wasn't given, they would have to admit you took it. I didn't answer right away. I just kept watching the screen until the clip ended, until the silence returned. Then I said the truth I hadn't known how to say before. I'm tired of proving I belong. Lucian's voice remained low. Then stop proving. That sentence was simple. It was also revolutionary. The private coastal ceremony wasn't planned like Charleston had been. No cathedral built to impress, no guest list designed for investors, no cameras positioned like predators. Only a fortress chapel overlooking the sea, stone warmed by sun, wind carrying salt through open arches. The same waters that once symbolized obligation now looked like distance from every cage I'd ever been placed inside. My dress wasn't chosen to flatter a dynasty. It was chosen because it felt like me, clean lines, no excess, nothing borrowed to hide fear. There were no lawyers hovering, no documents waiting on a table. The only paper present was the charter itself, already ratified and filed publicly, impossible to twist into a secret. The marriage was not a clause. It was not a headline strategy. It was a decision that stood apart from the machinery we'd built. Harrison came alone. Not surrounded by old allies. Not guarded by reputation managers. Just my father, older than he looked in Charleston, carrying the quiet exhaustion of a man who finally understood what his fear had cost. When he saw me, his eyes shimmered in a way that made him look human again. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he said, voice rough. "I came to witness what you made out of what I broke." The words hit harder than an apology. I nodded once, unable to speak for a moment. Then I said, "I'm not your debt to repay anymore." His breath trembled. "I know." That was all we needed. Lucien waited for me at the edge of the chapel, not at an altar that demanded performance. When I approached him, he didn't look like an emperor. He looked like a man who had learned to keep power from turning into entitlement. "You're here because you chose it," he said softly. "I'm here because I chose it," I replied. The ceremony was brief, but nothing about it felt small. The vows weren't grand promises designed for applause. They were quiet commitments shaped by honesty, acknowledging the world would scrutinize, misinterpret, and weaponize our union the way it had weaponized everything else. When the officiant asked if I entered this marriage freely, the question didn't feel ceremonial. It felt like the entire point of my life being spoken aloud. "I do," I said. And for the first time those words weren't surrender. They were ownership of my own choice. Lucien's response was equally plain, equally powerful. Not because he wanted a symbol, but because he wanted an equal. Afterward, as the sun lowered over the water, the global coverage began. Not immediate live stream spectacle, but respectful reporting shaped by the transparency we'd forced into existence. Analysts called it ethical restructuring. Diplomats called it a blueprint. Business schools requested the charter for study. The world finally had to admit that what saved Calloway shipping wasn't a marriage, forced or otherwise. It was disclosure. It was boundaries. It was refusing to let dignity be traded. Dominic Mercer's name surfaced less and less. When it did, it was in legal briefings and investigative pieces about predatory acquisitions and forged filings. The same media voices that once praised the Mercers' traditional values now called their strategy systemic manipulation. The empire that tried to absorb mine began collapsing under its own tactics. But my greatest victory wasn't on television or in the market. It was invisible. It was the moment I realized I could stand in a room full of power and not shrink. It was the moment I heard coded prejudice and didn't chase approval in response. It was the moment I stopped confusing endurance with virtue. What began as an interrupted wedding ended as a chosen union, an alliance forged in equality, not obligation. And yet, as night settled over the sea and the last guests drifted away, Director Hart approached me with a sealed envelope in her hand, her expression unreadable. "This arrived through diplomatic channels," she said quietly. "It was delayed on purpose. The sender insisted it be delivered only after your marriage." I took the envelope. The wax seal was unfamiliar, thin, silver, stamped with a symbol I didn't recognize. My pulse tightened. "Who is it from?" I asked. Hart hesitated. "A U.S. Federal Oversight Office." I stared at the seal as the wind rose off the water. The world had called this ending peace. But the envelope in my hands felt like the beginning of something else. As I broke the silver seal and unfolded the letter, the first line made my breath stop, because it claimed the original Calloway. Veil Covenant wasn't the oldest secret binding my family, and that someone else had purchased my name, long before Randall Mercer ever tried. Subscribe to the channel for more cinematic stories about power, betrayal, endurance, and earned peace. Each episode explores what happens when ordinary people stand at extraordinary crossroads and refuse to surrender their identity. Share your thoughts in the comments. Was Vivienne right to break the arrangement, even if it risked everything? And if you believe strength begins with choice, continue watching because the next story goes even deeper into the cost of reclaiming control.